Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Mission Impossible, starring Tom Cruise, Jon Voight, Henry Czerny, Ving Rhames, Kristen Scott Thomas, Jean Reno, and Vanessa Redgrave, and directed by Brian De Palma. Now, before I get into the series, I had a childhood watching this movie as a kid. And I just don't remember what was happening throughout the movie, and I don't know if it's just me to this day, or if I didn't understand what the hell was going on as a kid. So, let's just get right into this, shall we? We open the movie in Kiev when Ethan Hunt, played by our star throughout the series, Tom Cruise, is disguised, and I honestly thought he was the man he was disguised as. It's a very convincing makeup job for the IMF, which stands for Impossible Mission Forces. And we move on to Jim Phelps, played by Jon Voight, is on an airplane where he gets an assignment in Prague, and that was a good but weird opening for a first movie in a series opener. He gets the team together with Jim and his wife Claire, played by Emmanuel Baert. Ethan, as I brought up earlier, Jack, played by Emilio Estevez, which I didn't know that was him at the time either. Sarah Davies, played by Kristen Scott Thomas, and Hannah, played by Ingeborga Dupunkanate. Forgive me if I said that wrong. And they go on a mission in Prague, and that, as we are introduced to the characters, worked for me. I do like the gum that they call red light, green light, and it explodes. And we'll get that callback at the end of the movie. Jack dies in the elevator, and he was such a wasted character, especially for Emilio Estevez. And I honestly don't know what to think of the character other than he's useless. Jim fakes his own death, and that felt very obvious, and same with Claire, and again, way too obvious. Sarah felt like, once again, a very useless character, and Ethan calls Kittredge, played by Henry Czerny, and meets up with Ethan at a restaurant, or a bar, or whatever that is, and they never bring up how Hannah died in the same scene, and Kittredge tells Ethan about Max, played by Vanessa Redgrave. And Ethan blows Kittredge and the restaurant half to hell when they think Ethan goes rogue, and I like that action sequence. It worked quite well for me. I knew Jim was all bloodied up, was a dream, and I also knew Claire was alive all this time, and that scene was good but rather ridiculous. Ethan goes to meet Max for the first time, and I like Vanessa Redgrave in that scene. She convinced me as the corporate office manager, in my personal opinion, or some villain. It turns out she's a villain by the end of it. We get introduced to Ethan's new team with Claire, Luther Stickler, played by Ving Rhames, and Krieger, played by Jean Reno. And both actors I'm a big fan of, including Ving Rhames, who will always, to me, will be known as Marcellus Wallace in this movie. And I really like both Rhames and Reno in this movie. They're always fun to watch. That scene when Ethan goes into the silent room without making a noise and sweating at all was an intense scene because I was scared Ethan was going to get caught and captured, particularly since Krieger had a rat come up to him and almost drops Ethan to the ground. And almost drops sweat, and Ethan almost drops sweat, and he luckily catches it until Krieger drops a knife on the desk and doesn't hit the ground, which that was a completely close call. And Brian De Palma pulls that off very well, I feel like. I like the scene when Krieger shows Ethan there's nothing on the disc, and Ethan does some magic tricks. I thought that was pretty amusing that Tom Cruise pulls off magic tricks. Ethan makes a call to Kittredge, and Jim shows up, and I obviously knew he was alive, and tells Ethan Kittredge is the mole, and tells Jim he shot himself, and Krieger was working for both of them. And that twist was rather satisfying, to say Jim is one of the bad guys. That fooled you moment was again satisfying. We're on the train, and Ethan is disguised as Jim, and Jim pulls the gun on Ethan and Claire, and Jim's neighbor's wife, who was Jim's neighbor's wife, let me rephrase that. And Jim shoots Claire, and she's dead with no resurrection. And Ethan goes on the top of the train, which looks completely green screen, just terrible looking. And that looked terrible, and Krieger is on the helicopter going for Jim, and suddenly Ethan, as well as Jim and Krieger, are in a tunnel while Krieger is in the helicopter, and Ethan pulls off the red light, green light gum that explodes on the helicopter, and Max gets arrested. And that was a good ending for a first installment of a Mission Impossible movie. And now it's time for the rating. I'll give this movie a 6.4 out of 10. This was an okay movie for a first installment to a series that gets better and better. And I like the characters fine, but I do love Jean Reno and Ving Rhames here. The plot was kind of hard to follow, but it was a good action. But it has good action for all overall. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and next week I will be back with Mission Impossible 2. And until next time, mission accomplished.